55 BC. Julius Caesar lands in Britain with 2 legions. The British tribes mass on the beaches. Caesar's ships are damaged by storms. His cavalry never arrives. After 3 weeks of skirmishes, Caesar retreats back to Gaul. He tries again the next year, 54 BC, with 5 legions. He defeats some tribes, takes hostages, extracts promises of tribute. Then he leaves again. The tribute is never paid. The hostages are forgotten. Caesar's British expeditions are failures. Britain remains free for another 97 years until Claudius finally conquers it in 43 AD. But what if Caesar had succeeded? What if he'd conquered Britain in 54 BC and made it a Roman province a century early? How would Britain and history be different? In 55 BC, Caesar invaded Britain with about 10,000 men in 2 legions. His reasons were partly strategic. British tribes were helping Gauls resist Rome, partly economic. Britain supposedly had valuable resources, and partly personal. A successful British conquest would boost his political career in Rome. The invasion was a disaster. His ships were damaged by channel storms. His cavalry transports were blown back to Gaul. The British tribes harassed his forces constantly. Caesar established a beachhead, fought a few skirmishes, then retreated after 3 weeks. He claimed victory in his reports to Rome, but everyone knew he'd barely survived. In 54 BC, Caesar tried again with a much larger force, 5 legions plus 2,000 cavalry, roughly 25,000 men. This time he penetrated inland, crossed the Thames, defeated the powerful Catuvelloni tribe led by Cassivellonus, and extracted submission from several British kings. But then he left. Gaul was erupting in rebellion under Vercingetorix. Caesar needed his legions there, not occupying a distant island that produced little wealth. He took hostages, demanded tribute, declared victory, and sailed back to Gaul. The British hostages eventually went home. The tribute was never paid. Britain returned to independence. Caesar's conquest became a propaganda victory with no substance. Caesar failed in Britain for several reasons. 1. Logistics. Supplying an army across the Channel was difficult. Ships were vulnerable to storms. The weather was unpredictable. 2. Strategic priorities. Gaul was more important. Rebellions there threatened everything Caesar had conquered. Britain was a distraction. 3. Timing. Caesar didn't have time to consolidate. He won battles but couldn't stay long enough to establish permanent control. 4. Resources. Britain didn't produce enough wealth to justify the military investment needed to hold it. 5. British resistance. The tribes were fierce, knew the terrain, and could retreat into forests and marshes where Roman legions struggled. Caesar got what he needed politically. He could claim to have reached the edge of the known world, beyond even Alexander the Great. The actual conquest could wait. Britain remained independent from 54 BC until 43 AD, nearly a century. During this time, British tribes developed more sophisticated political structures. Trade with Rome increased despite no conquest. Some tribes became more culturally Roman through commerce. Others remained fiercely independent and hostile to Rome. Britain became a refuge for Gallic rebels fleeing Roman rule. When Emperor Claudius finally conquered Britain in 43 AD, he did it properly, for legions, massive supply chains, permanent fortifications, and decades of military occupation to follow. Let's imagine Caesar's 54 BC invasion goes slightly differently. Perhaps the Gallic rebellion doesn't happen immediately. Caesar sees more evidence of British wealth, gold, tin, iron. British resistance collapses faster than expected. Caesar decides Britain is worth holding. So instead of leaving after extracting tribute, Caesar leaves 2 legions in Britain over winter 54 to 53 BC. He establishes a fortified base near modern London. He appoints a military governor. He begins the process of turning Britain into a Roman province. This requires Caesar to commit. He returns in 53 BC with more troops, builds more fortifications, and spends that campaigning season crushing British resistance in the south and east. By 52 BC, when Vercingetorix's rebellion erupts in Gaul, Caesar has already established Roman control over southeast Britain. He can spare one legion to stay in Britain while taking the rest to fight in Gaul. With permanent Roman occupation starting in 54 BC instead of 43 AD, several things change immediately. 1. British tribes never get the 97-year breathing space to develop and organize. They're conquered while still relatively primitive and divided. 2. Caesar's political power increases enormously. Conquering Britain, a land beyond the ocean, unknown to Rome, makes him even more of a legend. This might affect the civil war with Pompey. 3. Roman military learns Britain earlier. The techniques for fighting in British conditions, building in British climate, and supplying armies across the Channel are developed a century earlier. 4. British resistance never coalesces. Historical figures like Boudicca might never emerge because Romanization happens more gradually with less initial brutality. If Caesar successfully adds Britain to the Roman Empire in the 50s BC, his prestige becomes almost unassailable. He's not just the conqueror of Gaul, he's the man who reached beyond the known world and brought it under Roman control. This might actually make the civil war with Pompey less likely. Caesar's enemies in Rome might not dare challenge him when his popularity is at such heights. Or it might make civil war more inevitable. Caesar's power becomes so threatening that his enemies have no choice but to fight. If Caesar lives longer, not assassinated in 44 BC, or survives the assassination, he might return to Britain to continue the conquest northward. A Britain conquered by Caesar himself, not by later emperors, would have different infrastructure, different cities, different priorities. With Roman occupation starting in 54 BC, Britain has an extra century of Romanization before the empire's 5th century collapse. This means infrastructure built a century earlier. Roman roads connecting British tribes by 40 BC instead of 80 AD. Roman towns and forts established during the late Republic. London, Londinium, founded in the 50s BC, giving it an extra century to develop. Hadrian's Wall built earlier, or perhaps a different northern frontier strategy. Deeper cultural integration. British elite Romanized by the time of Augustus, not Nero. Latin spoken in Britain for an extra century before the empire falls. Roman education, law, and customs more deeply embedded. British participation in Roman politics earlier, British senators by the early empire. Economic development. British tin, iron, lead, and grain feeding the Roman economy a century earlier. British trade networks connecting to the broader Roman world sooner. British towns and industries developing with Roman investment and technology. Military impact. British tribes providing auxiliary troops to Roman legions a century earlier. British military traditions influencing Roman tactics sooner. Britain serving as a military base for operations against Germanic and Gaul. This earlier conquest has profound religious implications. In our timeline, Christianity reached Britain in the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD. With a century more of Roman rule, several things might change. 1. British Druidism crushed earlier. The Druids were a major force of resistance. Caesar hated them. With earlier conquest, Druidism might be eliminated more thoroughly, erasing more of Britain's Celtic religious heritage. 2. Christianity arrives differently. If Britain is Roman a century longer, Christianity might be more deeply established before Rome's collapse. British Christianity might be less syncretic with pagan traditions. 3. Roman paganism more embedded. An extra century of Roman religious practices might make them harder to displace when Christianity arrives. In our timeline, Romans never conquered Scotland. They built Hadrian's Wall around 122 AD and eventually gave up trying to hold territory north of it. With a century more time, several scenarios become possible. Scenario 1, full conquest of Britain with conquest starting under Caesar. There's time to gradually push north. By the time of Augustus, 27 BC to 14 AD, Roman armies might have conquered lowland Scotland. By Hadrian's time, the frontier might be in the Scottish Highlands, not at Hadrian's Wall. This means Scotland is Romanized. Scottish tribes lose their independence centuries earlier. The entire island of Britain becomes thoroughly Roman, not just the southern part. Scenario 2. Different frontier strategy. Perhaps Romans learn earlier that Scotland isn't worth conquering, it's poor, mountainous, and requires too many troops to hold. They establish the frontier further south than Hadrian's Wall, maybe along the Tyne-Solway line, but a century earlier. This gives them more time to make the frontier region thoroughly Roman, creating a buffer zone that's more integrated than the historical Hadrian's Wall region. In our timeline, Rome never seriously attempted to conquer Ireland. With Britain conquered a century earlier, this might change. Ireland was poor and difficult to access, but it was also a base for raiders attacking Roman Britain. With an extra century of occupation, Romans might eventually decide Irish raids are too costly to tolerate and launch a conquest. Irish conquest would be extremely difficult, the geography is challenging, the tribes fierce, and the economic return minimal. But Roman strategic thinking might conclude it's necessary to secure Britain's western flank. If Ireland is conquered, even partially, Irish history changes completely. Roman Christianity reaches Ireland through conquest rather than through missionaries like St. Patrick. Celtic Irish culture is suppressed or Romanized. The Irish monasteries that preserved classical learning during the Dark Ages might never exist. With a century more of Roman rule, British cities develop differently. London, founded in the 50s BC instead of 40s AD. By the time Rome falls, London has won 50+ years of development instead of just 50. It might be one of the major cities of the Western Empire, larger, more important, more defensible. York, established as a major military base earlier, could be the capital of Roman Britain instead of London. Bath, the hot springs are developed a century earlier. Bath becomes a major religious and leisure center for the late Republic and early Empire. St. Albans, founded earlier and more thoroughly Roman, might become one of Britain's most important cities. With an extra century, Romans might found cities that never existed in our timeline, major settlements in Wales, northern England, even lowland Scotland if they conquer it. In our timeline, Roman rule in Britain ended around 410 AD when Emperor Honorius told the British to look to their own defences. Roman legions withdrew, and Britain gradually fragmented into post-Roman kingdoms. With conquest starting a century earlier, Roman Britain lasts from 54 BC to 410 AD, 464 years instead of 367 years. That extra century matters enormously. The longer Roman rule lasts, the more thoroughly Romanized Britain becomes. Consider language. With 464 years of Latin, the British might speak a Romance language when Rome falls, a Brittonic Latin similar to French or Spanish, not the Germanic Old English of our timeline. Cities. British cities are larger, more established, more economically integrated. They might survive the Roman collapse better instead of being largely abandoned. Infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, sewers, and fortifications have an extra century to be maintained and expanded. More infrastructure survives the collapse. Christianity, an extra century of Roman Christianity makes it more deeply rooted. British churches might be stronger institutions when Rome falls. Identity. Do the British think of themselves as Romans even after the empire falls? In our timeline, post-Roman British kingdoms remembered Roman rule nostalgically but weren't Roman. With deeper integration, British identity might be more Roman. In our timeline, after Rome fell, Britain was invaded by Anglo-Saxons starting around 450 AD. Over the next 200 years, Anglo-Saxons conquered most of what is now England, displacing or assimilating the Romano-British population. With deeper Romanization, this might go differently. Scenario 1. Stronger British resistance. Romano-British kingdoms with more resources, better fortifications, and stronger institutions might resist Anglo-Saxon invasion more effectively. Perhaps the Anglo-Saxons are confined to smaller areas, just the southeast coast, for instance, and never conquer all of England. Scenario 2. Different British identity. If the British speak a Romance language and identify as Romans, the Anglo-Saxons face a more unified enemy. British kingdoms might unite against the Germanic invaders rather than fighting each other while the Anglo-Saxons conquer them piecemeal. Scenario 3, faster cultural integration. Perhaps the Anglo-Saxons are absorbed into Romano-British culture faster. Instead of displacing the British, their Romanized themselves, adopting Latin-based language and Roman Christianity, becoming just another group within a fundamentally Roman Britain. The language that never was. This is the most dramatic difference. If Britain speaks a Romance language descended from Latin when the Anglo-Saxons arrive, and if that language survives the invasions, then English never develops. Instead, Britain speaks British Latin or Brittonic Romance, a language similar to French or Spanish but with Celtic substrate influences. It would have Latin-based vocabulary instead of Germanic, Romance grammar instead of Germanic, similar to French but with unique British characteristics, possibly incorporating more Celtic words than other Romance languages. Modern Britain would speak a language incomprehensible to modern English speakers, closer to French or Italian than to English. If the Anglo-Saxons don't fully conquer Britain, or are absorbed into Romano-British culture, England as we know it never forms. Instead of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, that eventually unite into England, we have Romano-British kingdoms that might unite differently or not at all. The political geography of Britain could be completely different. Multiple Romano-British kingdoms lasting longer. Britain more culturally aligned with France and Mediterranean than with Germany. No Anglo-Saxon culture, literature, or political traditions. Different relationship with Scandinavia, no special connection through Germanic language. Vikings begin raiding Britain in the 790s. In our timeline, they found Anglo-Saxon kingdoms they could attack and eventually conquer parts of. In a timeline with Romano-British kingdoms instead, Viking invasions might go differently. Different targets, Romano-British kingdoms might be more or less defensible than Anglo-Saxon ones. Different settlements, Vikings might integrate differently into Romano-British culture. Different outcomes, perhaps Vikings conquer more or less of Britain depending on how strong Romano-British kingdoms are. But the fundamental dynamic changes. Vikings in our timeline found Germanic cousins, Anglo-Saxons, who spoke related languages. In this timeline, they find Romance-speaking, Roman-descended people who are culturally alien. The interaction would be more like Viking raids on France or Spain. The British Empire as we know it emerged from specific conditions. English language and culture. Naval tradition developed as an island nation. Protestant Reformation changing British identity. Competition with Catholic powers, Spain, France. Economic and political development unique to England. With Britain speaking a Romance language and having a different cultural trajectory, this specific British Empire likely doesn't form. Perhaps a Romano-British Empire develops instead, but with different characteristics. More Mediterranean-focused than Atlantic-focused. Closer cultural ties to France and Spain. Different colonial patterns and priorities. Different relationship with Ireland, if Ireland was conquered by Rome. Or perhaps Britain never becomes a global empire at all, remaining a regional European power instead. The most far-reaching consequence is the idea of there being no English language. English is the global lingua franca today because the British Empire spread English globally. American economic and military power extended English dominance. English became the language of international business, science, and culture. Without English developing in our timeline, what becomes the global language? French, already widely spoken due to French colonial empire. Spanish, spoken across the Americas and parts of Europe. Portuguese, strong colonial presence. Arabic, influential through Islamic civilization. Mandarin could emerge earlier as global trade language. No global language, perhaps the world remains more multilingual. Modern international communication, commerce, science, and culture would all be conducted in a different language, or multiple languages instead of one dominant one. British colonization of North America led to English-speaking United States. Without Britain as we know it, North American colonization goes differently. French colonization, maybe France dominates North America. Spanish colonization, maybe Spain expands further north. Romano-British colonization, maybe a Romance-speaking Britain still colonizes America. No European colonization. Maybe North American indigenous peoples resist European invasion more successfully. Whatever happens, the United States as we know it, English-speaking, culturally British-descended, doesn't exist. American history, culture, and global influence all change completely. What would modern Britain look like in this timeline? The Britain we know, with English language, common law, parliamentary traditions, and distinctive cultural identity, doesn't exist. Instead, there's a Romano-British nation that's culturally closer to France or Spain than to the actual Britain of our world. If Julius Caesar had successfully conquered Britain in 54 BC and made it a permanent Roman province, the entire course of history changes. Britain becomes Roman a century earlier. An extra century of Roman rule means deeper Romanization, Latin becomes the native language, Roman culture and institutions become thoroughly embedded, and British cities and infrastructure develop more extensively. When Rome falls around for 10 AD, Britain has been Roman for 464 years instead of 367. That extra century means Britain might retain a Romance language descended from Latin. The Anglo-Saxon conquest might fail or go differently. England as we know it never forms. Instead of English, a Germanic language that became a global lingua franca, Britain speaks a Romance language similar to French or Spanish. British culture is more Mediterranean than Germanic. The British Empire either doesn't form or forms differently. Without the British Empire and English language, American history changes completely. The United States doesn't exist as we know it. The modern world, shaped by English-speaking global powers, develops along entirely different lines. One successful Roman campaign in 54 BC cascades across 2,000 years of history. Caesar's failure in Britain was one of his few military setbacks. But that failure shaped the modern world more than many of his victories. If Caesar had won in Britain, you wouldn't be watching this video in English. The language, culture, and history of Britain would be unrecognizable. And the entire modern world, shaped by English language and British power, would be fundamentally different. Which difference would change history most? Let me know in the comments.